Today, data retention, for judiciary, and the executive, the battle lines are getting clearer. Your host is Rick Falkvinger, and this is Liberties Report.
This report is presented by Private Internet Access.
Good evening and welcome to Liberties Report Week 11, 2015. Data retention, judiciaries, and executives. The conflict lines of surveillance society versus civil liberties are starting to crystallize. Who wants to safeguard your liberty and who wants to destroy it anyway? Data retention is, first of all, a quite deceptive term. It was an invention by hardline politicians following the Madrid bombings in the summer of 2004. This so-called data retention is a mechanism that violates every human right as we know it, or at least most of them. The idea is to put a wiretap or a tracking on every citizen preemptively before they are even suspected of a crime, with the idea being that if they are somehow suspected of a crime at a later stage, you'll already have surveillance data. As you can hear, this goes against every tradition we've had of treating people not under suspicion of crimes as innocent citizens. So with data retention, your mobile phone becomes a governmental tracking device. The idea being that every time you use that phone, be it initiating a phone call, looking something up online or whatever, a number of so-called metadata pieces are stored, including what phone you used, what method you used to initiate communications, what time it was, and where you were. These items, specifically the time and location, means effectively that the government took itself the right to equip every citizen with a governmental tracking device, or rather turn a personal piece of equipment into a governmental tracking device and record everybody's footsteps. That's how intrusive it was. Malte Spitz, a German politician, actually looked at this data and found it to be horribly intrusive, as we can see on this map that Herr Spitz assembled. So, hardline politicians got this idea in 2004. It was approved by the European Parliament on December 14, 2005. This sets it quite apart from the NSA or the GCHQ, because this mechanism is legal, or it is at least above board. You'll remember that the NSA's methods have been not just illegal, or at least arguably illegal, but above all they have been secret. This was a law passed by the European Parliament. Now, many countries or many member states in the European Union blankly refused to implement this intrusive mechanism. About 1/3 of the countries never implemented it, which is quite a striking non-compliance for such a high-profile directive. They simply cited concerns with fundamental rights. And in the end, the European Court of Justice struck down this directive, the Data Retention Directive, in April of last year, April 2014. That the European Court of Justice struck down the directive forcing member states to have this pre-emptive wiretapping, or pre-emptive surveillance, didn't mean that the laws magically disappeared in the individual member states. That just meant it was all of a sudden up to the individual member states again. So last week, a district court in The Hague in Netherlands struck down the Dutch data retention, annulling the law, vacating the law, and Paraguay Parliament refused to adopt a similar mechanism. So we are seeing a pendulum starting to swing back here. Of particular interest is the justification from the district court in The Hague, where the prosecution had argued that, yes, of course we get the ability to abuse this surveillance data, but don't you trust us? Of course we would never abuse this privilege like that, which the court totally didn't buy, and said, quote, "It doesn't matter if you exploit the possibility or not. The fact that the possibility exists is reason enough to conclude that the current safeguards are unsatisfactory," end quote. Now, the somewhat funny thing here is that hardline politicians, particularly in the executive branch, justice ministers and so on, have argued that anybody who's opposing data retention is fighting against law enforcement, fighting against a lower crime rate, and more or less want more crime. So this leads to the amazingly ignorant parroting, where the Dutch response to this verdict was that the courts want to prevent crime fighting. That's how badly it goes when you try to apply your speaking point to what just happened. Now, courts obviously do not want to prevent crime fighting. They are there to enforce the law, and this law broke the Constitution and human rights on so many levels. So this idea of courts want to prevent crime fighting is really the imbecile level of the nonsense we are hearing right now. So what we're seeing is the battle lines crystallizing. The United States and the UK are pushing for more surveillance on every single level. Latin America is fighting back. Some countries in Europe, Germany in particular, are also fighting back, as well as all of Eastern Europe, who, unfortunately, have a dystopic surveillance state in recent memory. UK is just going down the drain. As an example, extremist ideas were banned from universities this week, or announced to be banned from universities. And as usual, extremist is just one among many words in a collection, essentially banning dissent in general, under a number of conditions and so on. And this is unthinkable. I mean, the purpose of universities is to be inconvenient to power and established rule and law. And lore, sorry. You can also observe that it's been the executive branches of government that have been pushing for this in a hardline fashion. The legislative branches have been kind of divided, and the judiciary branches have been consistently fighting back, saying that no, human rights take precedence over your desire for pre-emptive wiretapping. So we can observe that in countries with a weak judiciary or a less independent judiciary, in general, you can see that those are the countries that tend to still have this pre-emptive surveillance, this pre-emptive wiretapping, whereas countries with a strong and independent judiciary tend to have already struck it down, which, interestingly, underscores the need for checks and balances and independent branches of government as a safeguard for civil liberties. I'm Rick Falkvinger, and this is Liberties Report. Visit our sponsor, Private Internet Access. Good night.
This report is presented by Private Internet Access.
Liberties Report is produced using exclusively free software.